Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Seed&Spark DEI Office Hours. We are so excited to have you join us today to talk about the role of storytelling in DEI work. Today, we're going to be discussing questions like how can we use story to foster community and belonging? Is it possible to use stories to create systemic change? And also thinking about like who drives the narrative and what message is that sending to folks. So I am Stephanie Monge, she, her, head of sales at Seed&Spark, but have been a professional storyteller for the last 15 or so years, starting as a journalist and then as a repeat founder and community builder. We have some really exciting guests with us today, including Hilary and Martina. So Hilary, would you go ahead and please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Stephanie. So excited to be here. I'm Hilary Trudell. I'm the executive producer of The Yarn, which is a storytelling organization out of Little Rock, Arkansas. And my pronouns are she, her. I have been coaching people on how to tell their stories for about 7 years now, starting my work doing that at the Human Rights Campaign. But I'm a theater major and a theater lover by education and trade. So that's where my background comes from.
Great. And Martina?
Hello, everybody. My name is Martina Potratz. Pronouns are she, her. I'm the head of equity and inclusion programming at Seed&Spark. I am in charge of curriculum building there for our Film Forward program, which uses cinematic experiences in DEI work. I've been in the space of DEI for the past 10 years, working globally with Fortune 500 companies around culture shifts within their organizations. And I am also a theater person. So I trained as an actor. That's where my storytelling background comes from. And I've done a lot of DI work around storytelling using acting skills and that kind of storytelling too, and seeing how that shifts minds in the room. So, and that's me.
Excellent. Thank you. And welcome to you both. So we're just going to dive right in. Like, how is storytelling related to DEI work, or how is it applicable? Whoever would like to start, let's just start unpacking this.
Martina, you want to go first?
Sure. I do. I think that storytelling, in the way I've seen it worked in DEI work, is really a space where you can create empathy and you can shift the lens through which people see the world, however that might look like. So be that through film, how we're doing it in Film Forward, or how I've done in other works that I've done where you do forum theater or role play, where you use stories in order for people to create a deeper understanding about other people's experiences that they might not be exposed to on a daily basis, that might be really far away from their own life experiences. And I've really found that personal connection is what often shifts mindsets and really shifts perspectives and how people see that. I feel theater is a really good way of doing that. I feel film is a really good way of doing that. And so that's where I have seen that work for us.
Yeah, I think we were talking yesterday, and the word that kept coming up to me is humanizing. Mm-hmm. Like stories are a way that we can really humanize kind of the other, or people who don't maybe look like us or share those experiences. Hilary, tell us about like the Yarn and the work that kind of you're doing there and the role of storytelling and equity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to just kind of go off of what Martina was saying about, giving an opportunity for others to feel empathy and be able to connect with people that potentially they have nothing in common with. And I put that in quotes because we often have, even if it's our core values, we have something in common with people, but figuring out how to metaphorically put yourself in somebody else's shoes. We're never going to be able to really understand somebody's experience, but storytelling, and this is also scientifically proven, has been shown to create empathy in humans. So we actually have a thing called neurocoupling that happens when I start telling a story. Martina's brain starts trying to put herself into my story, right? So it actually is a way for humans to be able to, in their minds, try to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, which is a really great gift that we have. I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that within the DEI space, so there is the, trying to get other people to understand individuals' perspectives, but there's also the empowerment piece that I've seen has been really important in the work that we do with the yarn. So when I first started the yarn, it was all about changing hearts and minds, right? I want to get other people's perspectives in front and stories in front of people that might not understand. And that's absolutely important, and that's happened. But something that I wasn't expecting that I find is even more maybe or as important is the empowerment that the storytellers get from being able to have a platform to share their stories. Because as we learn, so much, the people with the power are the ones with the microphones, right? So if we give other people the power to own, claim, share their stories, that in itself is doing a lot of really great work within the DEI space as well.
I think there's sorry, Stephanie, but I think there's so much, I think there's a whole other conversation, we might get to that too, is about representation, right?
Yes,
and when we talk about media and film and all of that, and who gets to tell the stories around that. And I think something I want to build upon too is oftentimes in my work, where you see where people are able to start shifting how they thought about certain things is when they have a personal or private connection to someone. So for example, if you have no understanding about the LGBTQIA plus community, but then your brother comes out or a person close to you comes out, and all of a sudden people are like, oh, now I understand, I am an ally, I care about this. And I think in our work, it's really shifting out of that private connection where you just know someone, and that's why you can shift your perspective is really important in the work. And oftentimes people can't get beyond that. And I think storytelling can do that. I think in Film Forward, what we're really pushing towards is using film to fill that space, to create that kind of connection, in order also to avoid, because what I also see, you oftentimes see in DI training, is then if that personal connection is not there, you shift towards people who have the marginalized experience, and you make folks then share their experiences, share their trauma, and make them perform for others in order to understand, in order to build that empathy. And that's just not a sustainable way of doing the work and shifting those mindsets. And so with film, we felt, and we see at Film Forward, how that can take that space and make that connection for people when there's a personal or private connection missing to a theme or a topic.
You touched on something that I want to talk about next, but I'll quick add one more thing. So I was reading this really interesting article from the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it was talking about how stories can impact systems and systems change. And it really presented this kind of thesis that stories can be used as light, so illuminating our past, present, and future. They can be used as glue, building community through empathy, like you both mentioned in your comments. And then too, story can serve as a web, and it helps us to make sense of those cultural and personal narratives and weave that all together, which is I think a really important piece of this, is that personal narrative. And to your point, Hilary, the emphasis on how empowering it can be to feel seen and heard, especially if you are someone who has historically not felt that you had that privilege or platform, to your point. But also, I think it's really important that folks opt in to this DEI storytelling versus being voluntold that you need to share your experiences because other people need to learn from you. So kind of to go in that direction, how can we use storytelling in a way that isn't harming the marginalized folks in the room, or perpetuating that in some way? What do you all think?
I mean, I think it's such an important thing that we're thinking about, and we're talking about. I constantly grapple with that in terms of making sure the work that we're doing is not creating this, okay, we're now going to educate all the white people on the, Black traumatic experience, because what are the Black constituents then getting out of that, right? And I had an instance like that a few months ago. We were doing storytelling as a form of racial healing, and it was the first time that we had done something that specific to racial healing. And I learned a lot of lessons about it, and very, very quickly we might get into some nuances of facilitation here, but how trust needs to be built in order for everyone to feel safe in the space, specifically marginalized people that are going to be potentially sharing their stories, and that it's not a one-sided benefit here, right? Like, if we're inviting people of color into a space to share their story in the DEI space, what are they gaining from it? Are they gaining empowerment? Is it healing for them? Because if it's just educating people that aren't, that white people particularly, then it's not doing the work that I think we should be doing. And I've been doing some affinity spaces as beginning to build those trusts. So essentially, how can we start with potentially people of color sharing their lived experiences together, white people talking about their experiences together, then kind of deciding, okay, how do we want to come together and tell stories as a form of learning and building trust together, but not, hey, we're going to educate all the white people on Black trauma.
Yeah, I mean, a word coming into my head right now, exploitation. Like, that's the thing, is like, we have to be careful that as we are trying to do this work in the name of equity, that we're not, unintentionally or in whatever way exploiting those folks. Martina, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. So some pieces that we've done in our work at Film Forward when we facilitate around films and themes and topics is my co-facilitator, Spencer, who is a Black man. And what we do sometimes is create these spaces that we separate virtual rooms by. We create a space for people who identify as a person of color or non-white, and for white people, and really separate those conversations out. And really, it's just very telling. These conversations are usually very, very different. People see completely different things in a movie when they talk about a movie or when they explore a part of a story. And it makes sense to start a conversation around that in order to, and I'm sometimes a bit hesitant also with safe spaces in facilitation, because especially in a virtual world, I find it sometimes hard to say that this is a safe space, because you don't know how well people know each other, and you can create a space where they might feel brave to share certain things. And I coming to that safe space is always, it feels that is the real work that we're doing, and that is very challenging. And then it feels, in the sense, as consultants, or when you come into a space and you facilitate, you also the person that gets to leave afterwards. And people who had marginalized experiences in the workplace, they have to stay behind. So oftentimes it's like, I will not, I'm not going to go too far here. Why would I share all of this with all of you? And I have to afterwards deal with the consequences around that. And a second piece around that I do think is really important when we have these conversations, that education oftentimes needs to happen before these conversations start, so people can have a shared framework or shared basis and understand how they want to have these conversations with each other. So some folks in the room don't have to do all the educational work for other people in the room. And I think that that's really important as well.
And something else, absolutely, with the safe space, and that's something that as a facilitator I've had to shift within this DEI space. Like, we can never guarantee that, right? I don't know what anyone's going to say, so I cannot. But we're going to try with these norms around it. We're going to try to create as open a space as possible, but you can't guarantee safety, right? I think with the yarn, our shows are live, so people get on stage and share pieces of themselves. They are vulnerable. They're giving something to the audience. And so even in that space of when you're talking about kind of knowing each other, and the film provides this opportunity to see someone and I can connect with them. So our storytellers are getting on stage and creating this space for connection through vulnerability. And we're hoping that simulates a personal connection, right? Even though I might not know X, Y, and Z person who just did that, I see them, I hear them, they're telling me their true story, and hopefully that is, in a sense, oh, I know someone, right? Even though we're not friends, but I know this story. We also had a little bit of pushback at the beginning. I had some questions, like, are you going to take questions from the audience after these shows? And I said pretty definitively no. I think with storytelling, if somebody is choosing to be in a space of vulnerability and speak from their own personal truth, and they're giving of that gift, like, they don't need to be asked any more questions. And obviously in a space of discussion, you can ask, hey, may I ask a clarifying question about it? But with our shows, there's no panel at the end.
Yeah, a couple of things you mentioned there, that vulnerability as a way to build connection, I think is something that we can really all relate to, that experience. And I really like that idea of not having questions afterwards, because again, it gives the speaker that control over sort of how much they are sharing, and they're able to have a boundary in a way that again allows them to feel safe in sharing. And something I wanted to say, when we've been thinking about like safe spaces and like if that even exists anymore, and it sounds like we're undecided. But brave space is something like that we talk about a lot at Seed&Spark. And so that brave space, really embracing that vulnerability as a way to connect. But again, like with being able to kind of decide how much you're sharing and like what you feel comfortable with.
And I also, if I can just jump in with what Hilary's saying, bravery, right, in a brave space also has that kind of boundary where you say, I will not take questions around this. And this is how far the conversation, this is what I share with you. And those are my boundaries. So I think that is also a piece of being brave and creating brave spaces.
So thinking about these brave spaces and this vulnerability, fostering connection, we've already kind of hit on this a little bit, but is there anything else you want to share? Maybe even like an example you've seen of stories to fostering like a sense of belonging or a sense of community. Is there anything that you can think of that you would want to share, or even just like generally, what are your thoughts on how stories foster community and belonging? I have a puppy who's dreaming and like snoring behind me, so if you hear yipping.
Martina, do you want to go first? I have a couple of thoughts, but I would love to hear from you.
A couple of thoughts in terms of, I think that goes a bit back to representation too, is when you are, when you find yourself being the only one in a workspace, for example, and then watching a movie or seeing yourself reflected back into the organization, that your experience, that can show that experience to other folks as well. I think can create a sense of belonging and fostering bringing these stories into the workplace to make sure, to create visibility for someone who might be having a marginalized experience in the workplace, I think is something that you can do a lot. And I think that's something, especially when you think about invisible diversity. So we had an example where we just worked with an organization for Military Appreciation Month. We looked at a movie for veterans, which is, there are so few, if you look at population in general, veterans are an invisible minority in society, but bring very specific skill sets, and also oftentimes their own stories within the workplace, and oftentimes workplaces don't know what to do with that, right? And so bringing that into visibility and using stories to see, there are veterans amongst you, have you considered this, and how can you create that kind of belonging and sense of community? Can you understand that you might have not considered what someone's lived experience is just because you cannot see it, or it's not that obvious to you, at least. I think that's something that where we've really been looking at lately with this piece.
I love that. I want to do so much work bringing veterans' voices up. I love that you uplifted that. Yeah, so I think I also, just disclosure a little bit about me. I'm a little type A, and I'm also a theater professional. So we have to rehearse before we go on stage, right? So these stories that people bring to the table, we talk them through, they practice, and they have a rehearsal before they go on stage. And as much as I created that to be part of my, okay, you have to practice before you go, it has become the space for so much connection that I just didn't even anticipate. Because we've done stories on incarceration. So we bring, these storytellers together. They're all in a room with just them sharing their stories. And the energy and the talking and the, oh my God, me too, or, oh, I had this, there's just this, and this great quote from that article that you sent, Stephanie, from Steinbeck, you are not as alone as you thought.
Yeah. Yes.
And that is just like, in our we do Out Loud, or we've done 4 or 5 shows for National Coming Out Day. And the LGBTQI experiences of those storytellers, living in the South, they're just like, oh, I am in a space where everyone understands.
Mm-hmm.
I am not. And so it's just, even talking about it, I'm like, the energy, and I have to be like, okay, come on, let's go. And they're like, we're going to talk forever. And that's empower. And that in itself is building this power, right? Like, they are not alone. They are connected to these people that are in their storytelling crew, and these strangers are with each other for 2 hours, and it's like they've known each other for forever. So that's been pretty cool.
Yes. Representation is so important. And I would say at the beginning of my sort of transition into working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, like 12-ish years ago, I was working with a nonprofit that served girls in underserved neighborhoods. And we were doing a STEM program, like an after-school program. And so as we were like thinking about like who would be our partners and who would be the teachers, and I was talking with the nonprofit who we were working for, they were just saying, like, it's really important that you have women of color as the teachers and as your volunteers who come in and facilitate this work, because it's so powerful for the girls to see people who look like them. And it just starts to kind of expand the possibilities. I think we've all heard, like, if you can see it, you can believe it. And isn't that the truth, though? As a woman who has spent a lot of my career in tech, before that in media and spaces where it has been male dominated, it has been predominantly white. It has been so powerful in my work environments where I am around people who look like me, who can help me foster that sense of belonging. And it's just interesting how much when like we don't have to do that extra work of sort of like covering or code switching or trying to fit in, and can really be authentic, like how much that actually then goes to foster that greater sense of community and connection with the folks around you. So that belonging piece is so powerful. Max agrees.
Yes.
So thinking about systems change, I think my big takeaway from the last year, and I mean, this was building before that, is just like, whoa, like we really cannot look at these sort of issues, all of the issues we are facing in our life and our time right now, and look at them as separate. It's like, these are systemic issues. They are intertwined. They are connected. If we are going to be able to dismantle these systems, we have to really think big about how we do that. So stories, I think, are a powerful way that can happen, or we can start to do that work. So let's talk about that. Like, what is the possibility there for stories to influence systemic change?
Martina, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. I don't want to always go first. I'm like, Hilary, you can go first. Yes, I do think, can I give an example of something that I've seen happen in the workplace with one of our partners or our clients is I do think that these small moments where we create change within a person, within a team, that these ripple effects that it can have to create a systemic change. I always think these connections are very, very clear and very strong. Sometimes it takes the right people to ask the right questions in order to create a systemic change. One example that we had around how storytelling specifically changed how an organization worked towards their health insurance coverage was we shared a movie with them about the experience of a trans woman in the workplace, and that fostered a larger conversation about what is the experience of trans people in the workplaces, what is then the experience of trans people in our workplace. And what was surfaced in those conversations was, well, when we sign up for health insurance, we only have a binary choice around gender identity, for example. And that came out of watching this movie and thinking about how can we be allies to people who have this experience in our workplaces. And so once that was surfaced, people really started thinking about, we have to change that. That's obviously people missing out on coverage because of that very binary thinking around that, and also had never thought about it before. So again, representation, if you don't have people in leadership who think about these issues and topics, then it won't get surfaced. So again, it takes the right person to bring it up. And what they found out is that the limitation there was actually from the health insurance providers. It wasn't actually just them. So they started lobbying their health insurance provider to also change that binary. So it became this ripple effect that really worked towards them, from a moment where someone asked the right question to really working towards a systemic change, coming out of storytelling where someone started to consider different life circumstances, potentially than their own. And so I found that those connections between storytelling and working towards systemic change, because that takes time, which is sometimes also the frustrating piece in our work. That I found that very empowering for the work that we do and for the storytelling piece around that. So that's an example that I can share.
Yeah, I think the awareness building, I had no idea that this was an issue. I think storytelling is a huge component in letting people know what's going on, right? I guess I'll give a little example on that. One of our first Out Loud shows, a friend of mine came because one of his friends was in the show. His friend was a straight ally, but he was a little kind of not really, I guess, how do I say this? He didn't really understand the LBGT issue or why we needed to advocate, why, what, it just wasn't something that was important to him. And so he, after one of the storytellers was a lesbian woman who told a story about how she had been fired 3 times because of her sexuality. And after her story, he leaned over to me and said, I had no idea. And so that moment was really small. And I'm not saying that he went out and became a lobbyist, but he has a seed, right? And I hate Seed and Spark. There's a seed now in his mind, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, this is actually more important than I thought it was. And I think the storytelling really helped with that. The other thing I'll say, so there's the changing hearts and minds. There's also, and it kind of got me thinking, that Preaching to the Choir article you sent, Stephanie, of empowering the people that think, maybe agree, but have lost hope, don't feel like there's any way to change things, right? So I think giving people an opportunity to share their own story is empowering, and it also provides hope. Like, oh, these people are listening to me, I'm connecting with them. Maybe it's not as hopeless as I thought. And so within cohorts that are marginalized, just people in general that just feel like nothing I do is gonna change it, but being able to tell your story, people to listen, I think there is more power in that choir scenario than maybe I gave credit to at the beginning. I don't think it's all about changing people's mind. I think it's also about empowering people to act.
Mm-hmm. I really love what you're saying there, because I think this it can be very draining to have this experience and have this be your lived experience over and over again, that you're either the only one or you feel you've just done so much work and the pace is so slow, or we're moving backwards on certain topics, right? And that creating that, and I think these are probably pretty safe spaces where you build that kind of community that you're talking about, Hilary, where people find that hope and that power within their shared stories too. And I wanted to lift that up. I find that really empowering to hear, and really it's hopeful to hear these kind of stories too. And I do want to also uplift a piece about planting a seed in someone's brain or heart, right? Sometimes that's all you hope for in the work you do, is planting that seed, and then you go away and you hope that seed will create something later on, and you might never hear about that work, what comes out of that or what grows out of that. But I do think that's such a big piece of our work, and can never be forgotten about how important that piece is as well.
And one more thing I just want to add in terms of, we're talking about kind of the current, how do we do this work now, right? And that we're so divided. And I do think storytelling has the capacity to breach those walls if we continue to use stories from our own. We speak our own truth, right? My story is not my opinion on X, Y, or Z policy. I'm telling you something that's happened to me, right? And it's very hard to disagree with someone's story, right? You can disagree on, who you should vote for, why this policy should be enacted and why it isn't. But if I tell you, hey, listen, this is how I grew up and this is what happened, you now know that, right? And it's not, this isn't a disagreement. I'm just sharing something with you and hopefully planting a seed.
Counterpoint, as a Black woman, my truth is often questioned. And things that I assert as my own experience, people will gaslight and be like, but are you sure? That's not how they meant it. And will question. So I just want to say yes. And that really does kind of speak to who do we believe? Whose stories do we believe when we do hear them? And who do we question? And who do we then, based on that story, assume is an authority or not? Because it's possible, right, to use stories in a nefarious way to present yourself as an expert in something that you're really not.
And I really want to uplift that and thinking through, again, representation, right? If we see certain stereotypes perpetuated throughout, and then who gets to tell, who has then the power in the storytelling to then be able, okay, let's shift the narrative. Who are the filmmakers who are allowed to make that shift, right? And who then gets believed to be able to do that? And you see sometimes very wild representation in how that, where you say you should probably not be the person telling this story, right? But because you have no system in place to uplift the right storytellers or to uplift people of the community who can represent the stories. And I'm just thinking this because there was this whole article coming out about Kim's Convenience Store, which is a Netflix, I don't know if anyone's been following, it has been really beloved in Canada, sharing a Korean-Canadian family's life story. I haven't seen the show, but they closed the show, and what came out afterwards, there was no representation in the writer's room, and the actors were asked to perform storylines that they felt they had better input on and couldn't share. And so that's a piece of that, not believing someone's lived experience and saying, I still know better than you do. I do not believe that you can tell that story better, even though you have that lived experience. And I think there is a lot of work around that and needs to be done. And I feel, some of the work you're doing, Hilary, there is definitely also a vehicle to get toward that piece where we uplift the people who know how to tell the stories.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that point up, Stephanie, because it's like, this is the world that I want. Like, this is my experience. You can't argue with it. But you're right. It's like people still argue with it.
But are you sure?
Yeah, and how infuriating does that feel, right? Like when it's like you're telling of your own story, it's the thing that you own, and being able to share it is so powerful, and to be doubted in your lived experience. I mean, that in itself is something that we have to grapple with. Why do we believe certain people?
Right, exactly. And so just to backtrack a little bit, thinking about like systems change, I was thinking about the role of personal narrative and the cultural narrative, and how it's like we have to kind of work on shifting both of those things, because to both of your point, like we need folks to have moments of understanding and to just like reach new levels of understanding of other folks' experiences and why they should care. But also I'm super hesitant to say like DEI work is about trying to make people care, because like it isn't. It's about getting better, more equitable outcomes. From my perspective, at least, the DEI work that I do, that's what I'm looking for. It's like, I want you to empathize, but then I need you to change your behavior, and then change the behavior of your friends and your family and set that good example, which that's my dream of sparking this change eventually. But yeah, so just thinking about the role of just like that personal narrative and how that is part of it, and the stories we tell ourselves about others, about ourselves, about what is possible. Even kind of back to that representation, thinking about just like expanding to new possibilities of thinking about what's possible for yourself based on the stories that you are collectively like hearing and seeing happening around you. So just the thoughts I've been holding in my brain.
Something that I also teach at the Clinton School. Is my full-time job. And something that I have my students do when they're put on teams to complete projects, and something that I have them do at the very beginning is we use the Marshall Gans telling your public story, story of self, story of us, story of now, and they have to write their story of self and share it with their teammates. What they include in that story is completely up to them. You know, they can get it's up to them. It's just tell me your story of why you were here and interested in public service. And so then they have to, well, our next step is essentially for them to connect those stories to who are we together, and then what do we want to do, right? And I really like that model. Yeah, and he did a lot of work with the farm workers rights movement in the 60s. But I love the model because you have to connect. You're in this, right? So what is your story and how does it connect to the whole? And I think that also helps create accountability with my students, as well as buy-in, as well as I'm going to change I'm going to suspend my narrative of this person that I don't know. And I also have them watch Adichie's Danger of a Single Story to start thinking about what are my assumptions about these people that I'm in a group with, and how can I challenge them? And I think those together, when we're talking about systems change, like we have to work together, right? And so understanding ourselves, understanding people that we're working with, and what is our shared narrative, I think are the first two steps that can be really important.
And just one thing I want to highlight there is it is about, you know, the stories we accept, but also thinking about what stories we'll question, but like in a good way, like questioning our assumptions, questioning those like stereotypes, questioning what we thought about someone's lived experience. So I definitely think that there are important times where we should be questioning the stories that we're telling ourselves and telling each other, and being more curious about like, well, is it really that or not? So I just want to say, like, there is a time and place for sure to question those stories.
And also you only ever, oh, sorry, Hilary.
No, go.
And you only ever know what you know. You only ever know what you lived. And so I think that's why storytelling is so important in this work, and also why I love working collaboratively in this work, because you only know a very small slice around what the world feels like, looks like. And in collaboration and through storytelling and expanding and questioning your own reality and how you see the world, I think once you accept that is how the world is, you will constantly be questioning yourself. It's kind of uncomfortable to live that way, because you constantly asking yourself, you constantly evolving around that. It's not very comfortable to live like this all the time, but you will understand a lot more about what other people experience. You will stop questioning, you will start listening better. So there's a lot around that I feel yes, in a collective and in sharing those stories, that's where you get to that place.
And the personal work to be able to, like, to even just to tell your story of self, right? So many people don't think about why they do what they do, or why they think what they think, or what their story of themselves is. And the work of really getting into that and telling another person opens a little bit of a door to then start thinking about other people, right? It's just this vulnerability. It goes kind of both ways, right? It creates these connections. But for those who I have students who are very resistant. Why do you want me to tell anything? You know, this is all like gushy stuff. And it's like, well, you have to be vulnerable to have some sort of connection with the people they're working with. And it's interesting, there's resistance to it by, you know, sometimes white men. And that's interesting as well. Like if we break those walls down just a little bit, maybe we can create more of a space for empathy.
I am loving this conversation and wish that we were going to be having it all day. However, we're in our sort of last 5 minutes here.
We are.
And okay, I have one question that might be our last question, or we'll have one more after this. So we'll kind of see how this goes. But thinking about somebody who is maybe interested in starting to introduce storytelling or the idea of story into like DEI work, what is an ethical and equitable way to start that? Or what are some considerations to maybe avoid to be ethical and equitable in kind of getting started in this process? Any thoughts on that?
Gonna let Hilary start.
Oh no, I was about to say, I was like, you're definitely more of the expert on this, but I will say, somebody's story is always their own. Anytime we have a storyteller who wants to share their story on stage, we have them sign an agreement, which is essentially, do you want us to share your story on our podcast, on social media, on our website? And they can say no to everything, right? And that is complete. If any time you change your mind about this, which we have had storytellers, because after years, something has shifted, maybe they don't want it out there. It's their story, and respecting that it's a gift when someone gives you their story, right? If I'm going to be vulnerable and speak something about myself and share it with you, like it's a gift. And when marginalized people do that, it takes even more of, I'm going to step out here on this limb and share this, right? And so respecting it's their story and not using it against their permission or in any way other than what they want. I think there's a lot of trust building that needs to happen. Not just, hey, I hear you have a story about how you got evicted. Can you tell me that so we can put it on our website? It's, let's talk about this. Do you want to share your story? What can you see us potentially helping you do with it? Is this something that you want to share publicly? Is this, and building that trust is really important. The last thing I'll say is, we touched on this a little to begin with, but making sure that you're not asking marginalized people to tell their stories to educate other people. If it's something they want to do, great. But I think we need to be really careful not to, ask our people of color to re-traumatize themselves for the sake of white people. And I will also say, on the other hand to that, white people being in a space with people of color and talking about racial equity, I don't know that people of color necessarily need to hear the stories of white people's racist grandfathers. Like, I just don't know that that's helpful, right? So how can we potentially create those affinity spaces to begin with and then come together? There's just so much trust building, and it has to be done carefully.
Yes, I think like with intent for sure.
A piece around what we are in the Film Forward program at Seed&Spark, where we're looking for using it in storytelling equitable is we make sure that we ask the filmmakers, obviously we ask them for permissions, we have contracts in place with them, and we pay them for the work that they do. So a part of our profit goes directly to the filmmaker. It's a way for the filmmaker to get paid for the story that they made, for the art that they made, for the story they told. So that's a big piece of our work there as well, making sure that we look at who is telling these stories, who are the storytellers that we are involving. And there have been stories where we're like, this is a wonderful story to teach around. And then we look at the team behind the camera and we kind of like, hi. That might be we might not be able to use this movie, but then you have another conversation around that. What you can ask, why did you make this movie? What's your connection to the story? And there's a lot that you can find out around there as well. So also not shutting the door around that, but being very mindful and careful who you're choosing into these programs, making sure that people are being paid and paving the way that their stories are being seen by people in the workplace that might have not been seen otherwise, because short films might not be something that everybody follows. And there's a whole world in short films that is just, there's so much to share and so much to see there. So I think these pieces are just also really important to make sure that you share, when you make profit, then you share the profit to the people who tell those stories. And sometimes you have also storytellers and filmmakers that are excited to join the program, and then they share their own research around the topic. So then it's really for us to be mindful of what did you want to, what's the story behind that you want to tell around that, what's the educational piece you want to tell around that, and include that in the learning process there and share that as well. So be mindful of that as well.
And one quick thing I'll add is something that has been essential to our work, making sure that we are choosing themes that resonate with our community, is community partnerships, right? So we wouldn't really still be in existence without community partnerships, and making sure that we're highlighting stories that the community also cares about. And it's not just, hey, that would be really cool if we do a story on, or do a show on this, making sure that we're engaging the community every step of the way on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the last thing that I would want to add, kind of related to this, is just like as you're trying to learn about the experience of a group, go make sure the stories you're listening to are actually from people within that group. Like getting that sort of like firsthand source and exploring. So it's like, don't, all right, I'm going to be really controversial here. But it's like, if you want to understand the like lived experiences of anti-Black racism, like in the United States, don't go buy a book from a white author. Like, I mean, go and like find a book and like support people of color who are telling you their stories. I mean, something I've said before, like Twitter, go like find people of color on Twitter to follow and like understand and just learn directly from them, is the thing that I would really just like advocate folks for as you are really seeking to use story as a way to learn. Just be, as we've said, mindful of who those storytellers are.
Absolutely. And one thing that we said a lot is like not asking people to educate you have that experience, but there are people who choose to do that educational piece, right? And these are the people you want to seek out. And these are the communities you want to seek out. There are people who choose to do this work and they are ready to do the work, and you meet them in the workplace and they're oftentimes very vocal about that they're the people you can ask. So +1+1, Stephanie.
All right, so we're a few minutes of our time, but I want to thank you so much, Martina and Hilary, for sharing your time and experience with us today. I want to thank everybody who tuned in for the live broadcast. If you are interested in learning more about how Seed&Spark uses storytelling in DEI work in the workplace, you can follow us on LinkedIn, find Seed&Spark on LinkedIn, and that's a great place that you can learn more. If you are a people and culture leader in the audience or a DEI pro and you are interested in seeing more specifically like how we use storytelling and film forward, we have a few seats left in a workshop next Tuesday. If you are interested in learning more, you can email inclusion@seedandspark.com. inclusion@seedandspark.com, and I will be happy to send you more information and see if you can grab one of the last spots. So thank you everybody for your time in office hours this week. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank
See you next time.
you. Bye, everybody.